Welcome to the Saturday morning keynote of the summit, From Ego to WEGO with Rak Razam. I am Stuart Preston, your moderator. I am the host of the Consciousness Podcast, consciousnesspodcast.com. I'm also the creator of the one-man show, The Stone Ape Show, which is part stand-up comedy, part talk about my story of grief and psychedelics. I love to explore the human mind and human consciousness, sometimes my own. So I'm very excited to be part of this amazing summit and even more honored to be a part of this keynote presentation. I had the opportunity to pick which one I wanted to be involved with, and I really wanted to be part of Rak's presentation here, so I'm very excited about that. But before we get into it, a little bit of housekeeping. This is going to be about a 60-minute presentation by Rak, and at the end of it, there will be a 30-minute session for Q&A. So if you have a question, just type it into that little question box there on the bottom right. And if you see a question that you want to ask and somebody else has already asked it, then give it an upvote. So the questions that have the most upvotes possibly will be more likely to get selected by me to present to Rak and get those answered. Also, unlike a live event, we have the ability, we actually want you guys to chat during this. So there's a chat feature over on the right. If you have a thought or a resource or something you want to share during the presentation, then just put it right in the box and have fun during this, because it's going to be an amazing presentation, and you guys need to make the most of it. So why don't we take that and go ahead and get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rak Razam, our keynote speaker today. He is an alchemical storyteller with his finger on the pulse of tomorrow and the heart of today. He's a screenwriter, a documentary filmmaker, author, journalist, and culture surfer. His focus is on the new culture paradigm birthing in this new brave world. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Aya Awakenings, A Shamanic Odyssey, along with the accompanying volume of interviews, The Ayahuasca Sessions. He is a frequent lecturer on ayahuasca and the shamanic revival sweeping the West. He wrote, produced, and co-directed the groundbreaking visionary documentary, Aya Awakenings. His latest documentary series is Shamans of the Global Village. Rak, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. So good to be here. And I guess I would just like to preface by saying that I'm very privileged to be speaking here at the Non-Duality Global Summit 2020. And it is 2 a.m. in Australia. So bear with me. I am still waking up. So yes, when I was introduced to the summit, I was encouraged to talk on this idea of the ego, because there is a lot of connection between the usage by Indigenous people of psychoactive medicines, which modern science is actually pointing towards, act as ego dissolvers. And it seems like there is a bigger relationship at play between the planet, through the plants, having a plan towards us. And so my discussion today is called From Ego to WEGO. And I ask these questions. I say, what role does the ego play in the human experience, and how and why did it evolve? Tribal cultures point towards other states of unity consciousness with nature as part of our collective hero's journey. And yet a fall from that state also pervades the myths of history. Is the ego a response to our species' PTSD, disconnected from nature and source? Are psychedelics the antidote to history through their dissolving of the ego, which has attempted to dominate the planet? And does the ego bounce back even stronger after ego death? And is this evolutionary adaptation a middle path forward? Are lowered ego states bringing us into the potential for group mind? Are we moving from the ego to the WEGO? So in researching this talk today, it really centers on a lot of the themes that I guess my life's work has been about. And like others in the psychedelic community, it's all about discovery, and it's all about who and what we really are. And you know, as we heard in my introduction, I've been an author, a journalist, a filmmaker. And you know what I have decided on as my ego identity has been changing in these times is that the central unifying thread between all the different works I've been doing in different media and different philosophies and different mystical inquiries is that of a storyteller. And that's what I've really realized is at the root of my egoic constructs and the root of my identity. And I think that role of storyteller and myth maker and someone who can see into the patterns of the world, which repeat, is someone who can help bring meaning to these times. So that's what I'm hoping to do in this talk today. That essentially, I'm not a trained scientist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I am a media maker. I am a storyteller. And I think that the need for myth, for a story, for meaning, is always crucial to a culture. And let's face it, these are unprecedented times. And what we're seeing in the world, both on a cultural level and a planetary ecological level, is this rapid transformation that is it's breaking down our sense of self. It's breaking down our entire sense of identity, both individually and collectively. And there's a grieving, there's a dying of the old. And yet there is this tantalizing hope that behind that there is something new coming. So what could that possibly be? Let's have a look. So I'd like to start just by examining, I guess, the definition of ego. And, there'll be different ones out there, but in some of my research, this is from Encyclopedia Britannica, it says the ego in psychoanalytic theory is the portion of the human personality which is experienced as the self or the I, and is in contact with the external world through perception. So, this is the fundamental filter. This is, it's a little bit different from mind itself, I believe, and I'll get into this in a minute. It's this fine grade of our operating system, which has a consciousness and has this program of the mind running in it. And we also seem to have another app running on the operating system, which seems to be this ego. I did note in some of my research that a lot of the translations from Freud, where he would talk about, superego and the id and different levels of egoic constructs, he never really used the term ego itself. In the German, that would refer to the sense of I. And this word ego is almost like a Western brand. It's almost like something that, yet again, not just science but psychoanalysis can compartmentalize and can reduce and seem to give us a map of the territory, but it's not exactly the territory itself, is it? So, I wonder, how can the mind know itself? And this is the grand inquiry of all the Eastern traditions, of many spiritual cultures, which seeks to understand, not just the meaning of life, but the meaning of us, the meaning of who we are, the meaning of what we're meant to be doing here. And there's a potentially a ravenous fixation of the ego or that part of the mind into knowing itself. And that really suggests that it doesn't know itself, that it is this evolutionary stepping stone that we're trying to remember what we are, who we are, and what to do with that. So there's many ways we could slice this down in talking about the mind or the ego or consciousness. So I'm going to explore just a few different tributaries of this geography that we all share. So here's an interesting one you may or may not have come across before, but we know that the sense of I and the sense of identity is a construct that is layered onto, let's say, the surface of the mind itself. And what we normally think of as, the broadcaster of consciousness or the mechanism, we fixate on the brain, right? And there's been a lot of anthropological reasons for that, a lot of looking at primitive man and the evolution of our structure and our brain structure. And we know that somewhere along the evolutionary path, our brain structure increased. And there's the old Terence McKenna meme and idea that basically maybe along at the savannah in our prehistory, it could have been an encounter with entheogens, maybe the mushroom, which bootstrapped our consciousness into a more self-actualized state, into a state which is aware of itself, and yet in doing so is separate from its environment, is seeing itself as a being, an I-ness, but it's doing so at a cost, which is to separate us from that web of life. So that's potentially something which has happened in prehistory. But interestingly enough, what modern science is saying about our makeup is that we essentially have not just the one brain, but we have three brains, essentially. The originating, three brains or three networks. The originating brain, you could say, is the gut instinct. And this is really important. There's a lot of advances with biology and looking at the microbiome and looking at the very fundamental nature of our relationship with trillions of microorganisms which inhabit our being, our microbiome in our stomach, and basically send signals and desires and can, in some instances, control our urges and our actions. And in the majority of cases, these microorganisms are in symbiotic relationship with us, helping break down foods that we can't break down on our own. We're actually a colony organism. We're not just this individual sense of I, like we think that the I, right? But it's always changing. And even within the solidity of the I, if we drill down, there is these relationships with other beings that are part of our I-ness, but we just don't recognize, we're not used to. So the gut instinct is a phrase, and there's something really important in that. It's an instinct, and it's older than the brain networks in the conscious egoic modern structure of what we consider to be us, to be a human being. They say that you have a thought about a third of a second before you actually register it in the brain, and that's because the gut instinct is where you originally know your feeling mind, not your thinking mind that we get trapped in the egoic structure. And so that gut instinct with the microorganisms, a neuroscientist once told me that basically there's the ability with EEG, with modern science, to measure the electrical impulses in the brain with EEG and MRI. They can also measure that in the gut. And apparently the microorganisms go in and out of fluctuations of states of being, and they go in and out of gamma, which is a unity state of consciousness. So there's a whole lot going on there in that gut-brain network that is older than the head network. There's also the heart, which we know has up to 70% of the same neuronal material that the brain is made of, but it's actually in the heart. So it's not just an organ which is pumping blood around the body. It's also involved in thinking, feeling, making, in connection with the brain. We basically have these three networks of intelligence, which are all part of this egoic superstructure. So that's a beginning point. That's a starting point, right? So even if you understand that you have this sense of I, this sense of beingness that is separate from the web of life and separate from others, there's also the idea of consciousness itself. I was saying that, basically the ego and the mind itself is like these programs running on the operating system. But then you really have to ask, where does this originating consciousness come from that the ego is running its program on? And so this is a whole nother kettle of fish that philosophy has been pursuing for millennia. One of the classical definitions of consciousness that I do really like is from a 19th century into the 20th century philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead. And he has a phrase he called consciousness, the awareness of awareness, or the apperception of pattern as such. So I really like that. I mean, it's very applicable to some of the psychedelic states when you were just an awareness of awareness hanging there in the void, or some alien vista. but you are aware that you are. And that is, perhaps the difference between consciousness and non-consciousness. Philosophy and has also been, arguing whether that consciousness is something which is originated in the brain, or now I would say the three brains. Is it something that is localized in the body, that is generated by the mind body, or is it something that is received? And there's some very cogent trains of thought on both sides. I lean towards the receiver of consciousness model, essentially because there's been a lot of studies done of people that have had injuries and brain damage, and consciousness has rerouted itself, and the ability to have a signal and to be a conscious being is something that's not necessarily anchored to the geography. The geography can reroute, and it can make do. It can find ways around. But there's a big and really important distinction between the understanding of consciousness as a local phenomena, which is generated within the body and the mind-body organism, which would then end with the body. And, the analogy is from the 20th century is like, if you have a TV set and it's receiving a signal and you destroy the TV set, the signal is still being broadcast. And that is one of the possibilities of consciousness itself, that it is being broadcast from a higher dimension or state of being. And in that sense, it would be non-local. And non-local is a little euphemism, which means it's everywhere. It's in everything. And this gets very close to a lot of the indigenous perceptions of the world, of spirit, of consciousness, of presence, of beings that are infused with this gift of life that is in everything, all states of matter, according to the filtration of their biology and how that consciousness can recognize itself. So there are lots of different models, around consciousness itself. It does get very close to quantum mechanics. And these are all models. All of these models of science are models which are evolving, and they're not static, and they don't know everything yet. There is a holistic drift and momentum to aggregate an understanding of who we are. And you've got to realize that all of these modalities and everything I've just mentioned, they're all filtered through this sense of ego, right? All filtered through this sense of humanness, of beingness. And that sense of ego is changing. It's always changing as well, not just through cultural change and this, exosomatic or outside the body evolutionary changes through our technology, but also through our understanding, through our memes, not just our genes. And these models give us a language to grasp towards some central understanding. And there have been centuries, if not millennia, of models. So all of that is pretty Western. One of the other templates and models that I'd like to just bring up in initiating this idea of what is the ego and what is the mind and what is consciousness and how are they related to each other are some of the Eastern traditions. So basically some of my shamanic work and work with sacred entheogens have led me to states of being of non-dualness, which in my trying to understand them have led me to Eastern mysticism. And there are some beautiful terms in Vedic culture, which really look at the idea of the mind itself as a state of being, which they call chitta, the mind stuff, and the sense of thought, which is a very precision egoic function, is the vritti. They call it the vritti. It's like wind on water. It's ceaseless. It's endless thought, always rippling, always having an extension of itself. It's consuming itself with its busyness, right? Then there's something really important in this, in the busyness of the mind, that there seems to be a distraction or a floundering or a desperateness of the mind to be calm, to be whole, to not freak out. I mean, essentially, I believe that a lot of the times, not just in the external culture, but even in our internal beings, we're subliminally freaking out. And that's the mind's activity. So in the Vedic maps, the chitta or the mind stuff is like a space of being within which the vritti or the thought forms are rolling. And they say that if you go deep enough into your own being, into that mind stuff, you can reach Atman, or your true nature. And this is where we start to get into the non-dualness of things. So there is a quote from Patanjali I'd like to read from his very influential book, the Yoga Sutras. And remembering that, yoga in some of the original translations essentially means the yoke of union. And so there's a duality in that, because union implies two things coming together. But once you're inside the union, it's one thing, and there's no duality anymore. So it's a little bit tricky, this world we live in. Here's a quote from Patanjali. He says, well, he's describing the sense of mind, and that sense of mind is like an ocean that lies within, and there's a shallowness to the ocean when you first start to go into the space of going within. And then if you continue to go, there is a depth to that oceanic expanse, to that sense of oneness. So Patanjali says, there is a bottom of the lake that we cannot see because its surface is covered with ripples. It is only possible when the ripples have subsided and the water is calm for us to catch a glimpse of the bottom. If the water is muddy, the bottom will not be seen. If the water is clear and there are no waves, we shall see the bottom. That bottom of the lake is our own true self. The lake is the chitta and the waves are the vrittis. When the lake is calm, that state is called sattva, or serenity. Now that's another good little indicator about serenity, because a lot of the Eastern modalities that have come out into the West, whether it's meditation or yoga or the martial arts, in their own way, they're all ways for us to calm this busy mind. It was a Krishnamurti, he said, still this busy mind, extinguish this busy mind. There's something about the individual mind, which is a product of the culture we live in essentially the West, right? And the West has been evolving into the West for over 1,000 years, but essentially it's become a globalized mind frame. It's become a filter, again, another egoic, it's a global species egoic filter of how we see the world. And it's become very mechanized, it's become very westernized, it's become very, very separate. And I really think that in that busyness of the mind, there's a trauma. There's something which seems to speak to me about not just separation, but of the trauma of separation. So, the mind and the ego can be brash, it can be rough, it can be obvious. You can sort of know sometimes when you're being egoic or when you're, utilizing the vehicle of the ego. But many, many times it's very subtle. It's very, very subtle in the way it pervades everything that we perceive in the universe. Even these more mystical, non-dual experiences are perceived from a longing for union, for belonging, for reunification. And, you have to ask, how did that separation happen? Why has that separation happened? Where did the ego come from originally that has become separated? And, Patanjali talks about the lake. I like the idea of the ocean, and it links to the poet Rumi, the Persian poet, who has a beautiful quote, who says, you are not the drop, you are the ocean in the drop. That undifferentiated oceanic consciousness, that sense of belonging, that sense of oneness that the non-dual state can reveal, is something that is counterpointed by this sense of not just oneness that is not the one, yet is somehow the drop separated from the ego. So why has that happened? It's something which I believe there are no mistakes, and there seems to be pointing to evidence of this separation as a traumatic incident in the individual and the collective field. So a few years ago, I was in Costa Rica at a retreat, and I was partaking of the sacred washuma, which is the grandfather cactus medicine. And I was having an unusually strong experience. It may have even been a 5-MeO reactivation in hindsight. It was an experience down on the beach of essentially an atomic dissolution of consciousness melting into the white light. And it was inevitable, and it was beautiful, and it was ego dissolving. And there in front of me, as I'm coming in and out of consciousness, scuttled this little hermit crab. And, you know, when I'm in these receiving head states, which is another facility of part of the ego, not just to have problem solving and logic, but to have this capacity for intuitive receiving of the signal, of all the information which is all out there, to deconstruct what we're in. And I just got this full download from the hermit crab. It was scuttering along in the sand, and it struck me that we are like the hermit crabs, that humanity is essentially separated from that ocean, which was right by us, and we had come out of that oceanic oneness, and we had armored ourselves like the crab to protect ourselves. And it really, really hit home, this idea that the egoic mind that we're in is part of our protection mechanism. And again, you know, to come back to the start, this is my story, right? This is my story that I'm sharing with you, and it feels resonant to me. So there's no scientific proof of this, right? We don't know about this fall into consciousness. We have a feeling. We're all feeling. And the thing is, you know, we're all in the same culture. We're all in different cultures, but we're all in the same cult, which is the root origin of culture, in the sense that we've all been brought up in this separation, especially in the West, you know, of the mind. And so many cultures that have come before us, especially indigenous cultures, have an understanding of connection to the earth. They have an understanding of oneness. And sometimes that's mediated through plant medicines and earth medicines, which alter consciousness. Sometimes the ability to commune with nature is its own mind-altering and mind-opening sacrament. That being embedded back within the web of life, being reconnected and rewoven into the sacred tapestry, is something which reduces that sense of ego and there creates a sense of belonging. So in counterpoint, the egoic consciousness we have today does to me feel a lot like a species defense mechanism, and it implies to me that something happened to us that has brought the ego in its modern form to the fore. So the ego is essentially not just your sense of identity, but it's how we navigate, right? It's how we choose to go left or right. It's how we choose to avoid the man-eating saber-toothed tiger, or how we choose to do. It's problem solving, and it's protecting us. So this arises in the psychedelic experience, where some people can experience fear because the egoic mind is protecting us from the unknown, from the ego dissolvingness, which we'll get to in a moment, of the psychedelic experience. But sitting there on that beach, having this intuition with the hermit crab, it really made me feel that we had been protecting ourselves, and that the egoic structure is gone up into the mind and it is out of the body. It's out of the body. It's not feeling safe. And I wondered what had happened. You know, I'm from Australia originally, and one of the indigenous originating peoples of this land, they have a concept which in our Western anthropological appropriation, I guess you could say, have called the dream time. And the dream time is such a beautiful phrase because it's embedded in the language of this dreaming time, of this capacity to get out of the rational linear mind into a more non-local distributed consciousness that is connected to nature and receiving information from nature to be reconnected. And I've, over the years, had interactions with different elders of the tribes, and even interviewed a few, and they basically say that the dream time is coming back, that it is a season of consciousness, that it is something that we have had and that some of them still retain a connection to, and that it's something that is possible for us to reconnect to, and that it's like seasons of consciousness. So there are many other cultures on the earth which also understand the idea of seasons, whether that's of world ages, of the zeitgeist, or of literally of consciousness itself, that there are different phases within which consciousness ebbs and flows in the human condition. Most famous, perhaps, you could point at some of the Mesoamerican cultures and maybe the Maya, who, as well as having an amazing understanding of time and the cyclic nature of time through their astronomy and their connection to the stars, were also a very shamanic culture, and were engaging in psychoactive right relationship with nature. So they were onto something. They understood the cycles of grand cycles of time and consciousness itself. So to bring this down a bit, to bring it back a bit more to the scientific record, around 13,000 years ago, the Earth experienced one of its many shocking climactic upheavals with an extinction event, which we have science has named the Lower Dryas event. It happened about 12,800, 13,000 years ago. Before that, we've gone through cycles of ice ages, and essentially the human species and the other species as well only proliferate during the interglacial warming periods, when the ice poles aren't as melted and not covering as much of the planet as, up to 4/5 of the planet, let's say. We have this blooming of species in the niches which are revealed when the ice ages leave. And about 13,000 years ago, when we were going from a larger ice age melting phase into a warmer phase, there was a resurgence of ice age. We don't know exactly what caused it, but it happened very quickly. And there was a shift across the planet in the archaeological remains from the hunting-gathering society we had been, which was more regulated by the planetary conditions, in such that all the species on the planet are regulated in a homeostatic relationship of balance. When they get out of balance, that's when one species starts to proliferate, and there's only so much energy on a closed system planet, and it's all affecting each other. So around 13,000 years ago, we shifted very dramatically to agriculture and to growing food, and to being in relationship with domesticated animals. And a lot of the conditions for viral infection have come from the conditions of boxed humanity. I mean, it's taken 13,000 years for this algae bloom of this one planetary species called, Homo erectus, the mankind, to spread across the planet. We're almost at 8 billion people now. It's a bit like an algae bloom, and it's a bit like a candida in the planetary biome itself, because we're out of sync. We're out of relationship with the Earth. We have fallen into this egoic consciousness, which is so separate from the Earth that it rapes and pillages and takes, and has forgotten the sacred relationship. And this is not just the sadness of humanity, it's sadness of the planet, that we have forgotten the mother, the sacred being that is alive, that we are part of, but we are seeing it like it's a resource, but we're just seeing it like it's alive, but we're not seeing the relationship. We're not feeling. And so this, again, to me, points towards what we know from modern psychoanalytic theory, which is very pronounced in its overlap with psychedelic culture of late, of things like PTSD, of understandings that there are experiences we go through as human beings which cause trauma. And trauma can affect us so deeply that we adapt to it and we don't even realize we're traumatized. So imagine 13,000 years ago, a species trauma descends on the planet. And in one generation, if not, one very short lifetime, everything changes. I mean, you may be feeling resonance with this now. Basically, overnight, everything changes. And there's a staging of grieving, of letting go of the old, of coming back to base chakra, of survival. And all of this is very traumatic. And the ego, the sense of I, which is helping us to survive, is navigating this tumultuous world, this world which is out to kill us, this world which we are separate from and not feeling the relationship with anymore. So I posit that we actually have, as a human race, species PTSD. And we are like the hermit crab in our shell, in our armoring, which is built up over thousands of years and cultural civilizations. And we are coming from a place of great wounding. And that essentially, that wounding is as long as history, or as his story, as Terence McKenna used to call it. So interestingly enough, Gabor Mate, who is a famous Canadian psychotherapist, and he's been working with ayahuasca. He's written many books, The Hungry Ghosts, things like that. He spent 20 years in practice working with addiction counseling in Vancouver. And he's a brilliant speaker, and you can hear many of his talks on YouTube. But he basically says that within his experience of addiction, there is always a root cause. There is always a signifier or a catalyzer. And there's always been trauma. And that the addict is essentially trying to heal themselves. The addict is trying to suppress the pain, to push it away, to make it feel better. And it feels to me, if we stretch this metaphor, and it's not much of a stretch, that humanity is addicted to the ego, and it's addicted to this state of being, this state of mind, which is consuming the planet and consuming itself. And it's coming from that sense of trauma that happened 13,000 years ago, as our entire locus of civilization shifted overnight, and we've gone into flight and fear. We've gone into survival, and we've gone into protecting ourselves, which over the thousands of years has become this technological algae bloom across the planet, which is basically cities now. Over 51% of humanity now lives in cities, disconnected from nature and going further and further into the virtual worlds, into our technology, into something which is protecting us from feeling. And this is a great danger and perhaps a civilizational dead end, right? So I'm just reiterating this idea that I believe that the ego is needed, that no one really wants to kill the ego, that the ego has a place, but that role of ego used to be navigating and protecting, but it wasn't as pronounced as it is now. That basically the ego state we have now is a deep sense of species trauma. So that trauma can be healed, and it needs to be healed, because we need to come back to ourselves and to each other, and we need to come back to the planet, because it's not something separate from us. This is what Indigenous people say. When I've gone down to the Amazon and worked with many of the curanderos and the shamans of the Amazon that work with ayahuasca, which work with other plant medicines, all over the world, the planet, here's a good word, secretes psychoactive substances, right? Now, psychoactives, you can use some ego little labels to define and to gradiate them down. You could say psychedelics. So the word psychedelic is only 70 years old or so, and it means originally psyche or mind manifesting. But look at the egoic conceit in that again, mind manifesting, like more mind. Do we really need more mind to manifest? So in the 80s, to get away from the stigma of psychedelics, academics coined the term entheogen, which is from the Greek meaning to invoke the divine within, any substance which invokes the divine within. So that's a little bit better, because it's not just the mind within, it's the divine within. And these substances in nature are everywhere, right? Every culture, apart from maybe the Arctic and Antarctic, has plants. And you've got to remember that everything is consciousness, not just in the planet, but in us. Like when we eat food, we're having a chemical reaction. We're changing our consciousness. When we fast, we're changing our consciousness. When we ingest ayahuasca or San Pedro cactus or the acacia DMTs or, you know, the dozens and dozens of other sacred plant medicines, we are changing our consciousness. So these substances are secreted by the planet. They are exuded, and they're not just random. I mean, there's been a little bit of scientific inquiry looking at, I guess, the energetic base load to create certain psychedelic substances within nature. And, you know, there's been some theories put out that things like tryptamines, which is a very basic, almost neurotransmitter, all through the plant kingdom, all through mammals, in the human organism as well, that connects us to the web of life very dynamically, that could be a it's not a poison, but that could be a protectant for the organism from other creatures. Well, it doesn't protect you from getting eaten. It protects you from this egoic sense of separation. It enables us to plug back into what the Greeks word for this is Gaia, for this idea of the planet, for the idea of the mother as a planetary organism. And this is a really big shift in the modern egoic understanding of who we are and what the world is. We're still seeing, you know, like this Copernicus Galileo moment of thinking that the Earth, the sun revolves around the Earth. We're still thinking that the Earth, in a sense, revolves around us. It's all about us. But we're just one species amongst many, right? We're embedded in the great mystery of nature herself. And she secretes these substances, the entheogens, which, when we partake of them, they perfectly fit the neural structure of our brains, and they unveil the great mystery. And they invite us back to a sense of union, to a sense of oneness. And remember that union idea is that whole idea of yoga, right? It's like Gaian yoga. It's like coming back to this sense of oneness with nature. And so there's no left-hand path with the shamanic medicines, with the psychoactives of Gaia. There's a direct felt psychedelic experience, psychoactive experience. And it's not a shortcut. It's not cheating. It's a sense of damaged ego, which is so separate from the planet that thinks that we have to do it all ourselves. We have the capability to go within. We can use modalities like breath work and meditation and, you know, different manipulations of consciousness to slog away and chip away at discovering what is within us and how we connect. But we're so already disconnected, we see ourselves as separate from the planet, and that taking a substance that is secreted from the planet that is meant to fit into our neural structure is somehow cheating or wrong. I mean, we're so damaged, we won't let Mother Earth re-embrace us. That's trauma, right? We don't want to be helped. No, we're fine. We can do it ourselves. We've got along fine for 13,000 years. Look at what we've done. We're on the edge now as a civilization. And in a blip of history in the last few decades, there has been a great resurgence in psychedelics, in man-made chemicals that alter consciousness that come from the lab, and in an awareness of indigenous cultures which have been guardians and caretakers of these plants and earth medicines. And they've been waiting, right? They've been waiting. I mean, basically, in our 13,000 years of trauma, we've been the victim of separation. And here's the thing about the separation. If you go back to the analogy of the Australian Aborigines and the Dreamtime consciousness, if you've ever had a psychoactive experience in nature and you have felt that connection, you have felt that oneness, you have felt that that beingness, that aliveness, that you are part of something bigger, you know, that it's not the conscious mind which registers all the details when you're in communion with nature. It's the heart. It's the gut. It's those older networks that feel, that know in like this Gaian telepathy, this feeling of knowingness of that connection, of seeing the ripple in the species and in nature, and of how that affects you. And you know before the mind knows. So if you can imagine that we had that connection, that it's broadcast, it's radiant, and all of a sudden 13,000 years ago something happened and there was a fall of consciousness and it was abrupt. And in that abruptness there was a heartbreak, there was a loss, and that loss was so great that we went into shock. And that shock has been the shockwave of history, rippling out and now covering the earth and killing the earth and endangering our place in the web of life and the entire web of life itself. So the guardians of these medicines, these entheogens that live in nature, the plant medicines, they were outreached and they were colonized, and they, when Western culture, which is the traumatized, damaged culture, went out back to the original world, the old world, it tried to subjugate it in the name of the church and in the name of religion and the name of kingdom and God or whatever. But it was horrified by the indigenous usage of plant medicines because it was so distant from it. And yet these people, which are us, I mean, there's one humanity here, one race, and it's like they've been caretakers of these medicines for when the rest of us have fallen out of relationship with nature and retreated to the safe zone of our caves and then our towns and then our cities and then our technologies. The indigenous peoples of the world are the great caretakers. They're the stewards of the sacred. And when I first went down to the jungles of Peru 15 years ago, I learnt a lot about that, about the role that they've been playing as gatekeepers of these substances. So we know from modern science that they've done some neuroscience analysis on what happens in a psychedelic experience, whether that's a psychoactive from the planet or man-made from the lab. So essentially, within that structure of the mind, we know that we have this thing called a default mode network, which is like this regional cluster of geography of the brain, which aggregates together into a sort of a frequency or a channel of reality. And when we take a psychoactive substance, it lowers or makes more permeable that default mode network. And when the default mode network goes down, consciousness at large has an ability to go out into the full spectrum of reality or of consciousness channels and to receive more signal and to go into the niches. And this is what the psychoactive experience does. And remembering that everything made in a lab is sort of, we're just like child's play. We're sort of copying and imitating and biomimicking nature. So nature makes these psychoactive substances. And, as I've researched, and you can see in the documentary series, Shamans of the Global Village, these substances are all over the planet. It's no mistake. She secretes them. And they're the exact substances which are needed in mammals. They usually occur in plants and sometimes other animals. And when we take them, they help us to remember. And this is really important because we're forgotten. I believe we've forgotten in our trauma. We've forgotten in our pain body. And when we're in the mind, we're not in the body. We've come out of the body. We've come out of the feeling. And we're living up here in this little safe zone. But we're not embodying. We're not living the fullness of the human being. And so these substances have an ability to lower the default mode network and to reconnect us to the web of life. So in the 60s, there was a few psychedelic philosophers and spokespeople. There was Bear Owsley, there was Gerard Hurd, one of the poets, who had this idea of, the earth as a living being. And you've got to remember, before about 1970, that was when the Whole Earth catalog came out, which was created by one of the merry pranksters, Stuart Brand. And this whole ecological revolution, which came out of the 60s, and the whole psychedelic mind frame, which reconnected to nature, reconnected to self, and helped to shift the course of history. But there was this idea of, we started to see the earth as an organism and as a being again. And the front cover of the Whole Earth catalog had a picture of the earth from space. And there's this understanding of holism, of Gaian, oneness, that it's been a long drift of history to get to a perspective where we can look out and then look back at ourselves as a planet and a planetary intelligence. But this is essentially what the sacred medicines that the planet secretes does. And this is what all these indigenous cultures have had the ability to do. to look out and to look within with these substances, to viscerally connect to the web of life and to have a relationship with that. So you could say that shamanism has kept this thread alive while we've retreated to what is now the cities, essentially, into the mind. And in the last generation or two, there's been a resurgence in Western culture, re-engaging with the indigenous stewards of the earth, with the shamans, the medicine people around the world, who they believe, hold these medicines. And these medicines are not a Western pharmaceutical concept. They're medicines of the soul. They're medicines of the planet to alleviate this sense of ego and separation. So we know that from science, they've done EEG and MRI, and they know that the default mode network goes down on psychoactive substances, and consciousness can expand out into the unity of the Gaian web. In the 60s, Gerard Hurd and Bear Owsley and McKenna in the 80s had this idea that the planet secretes these psychoactive substances as almost like species modulators, that the reason that they're in nature and that nature takes the time to gestate these substances is when they plug in to mammals from the plant kingdom usually, and we have the tryptamines in us as well, which is one of these psychoactive substances, that they act as interspecies mediators. That means there can be communication across the species lines, because when we go into these states, we drop the normal rigid ego and we receive more information. And sometimes that's information from the planet or from, other species in the web of life. And so they're like exopheromones, which are activating the human species to warm, to soften, to feminize in a way, to come back into relationship with Gaia, from this hard yang masculine action hero, got to save the world, but they're destroying it, to come back into oneness with the mother. And so this is part of this drift, I believe, from ego to WEGO, to coming home, to coming back to a sense of oneness and being and presence. So there's definitely something sick in the human condition in that separation, which I believe is embedded within the ego. There's a Native American Indian term they call Wetiko, which they believe is a little bit like a curse and a little bit like a virus. It's an idea of a spirit which infects humanity, and that spirit is cannibalistic. It's in a sense that it's driven by the ego. It's driven by greed, by excess, by selfishness, by self-righteousness, by all these aggregated qualities of the ego, which has a positive side. It's there. We don't want to kill it. It's there to help navigate. It's there to protect. But when it starts to go bad, when it starts to just be the I without the we, without the connection, over time, then we result in a humanity which is out of balance. And this Native American idea of Wetiko seems to be very astute and very appropriate to the global human condition now, where we're just so out of balance in that egoic PTSD that we have polluted and destroyed and are breaking down the fundamental life support systems of the planet. So something's got to change. And it feels to me that the indigenous people that have been caretakers of the medicines have been holding the space for us. So when it comes to this time, or comes to this fruition time of it, it's the world out of balance, the Konasquatsi. It's the last antidote to history, because we know that these substances dissolve the ego, and they are potentially what's been called, in psychedelic culture, an antidote to ego. That psychedelics are relaxing the egoic, individuated, traumatized mind, and they're opening up. So much so that in psychedelic therapy now, it's used, and there are protocols and whole templates for psychedelic therapy to help alleviate and work to cure PTSD in individuals. So you look at psychoactive materials like MDMA, which is an empathogen, not quite a psychedelic, or psilocybin, which is very popular now. Things like 5-MeO-DMT, which is being explored as well for PTSD research. There are this applicability within the medical scientific paradigm of using psychedelic substances to directly and very successfully cure PTSD trauma in very significant cases. The MAP studies, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, have been sponsoring, psychedelic research legally for many years now. They're seeing with some of their research treatment-resistant PTSD being alleviated and cured in a few sessions with psychedelic research. So there's an obvious tool here that the psychedelics are proven to cure trauma. And if we feel into that deeper, and science also says that psychedelics reduce the egoic mind. And the egoic mind is what separates us from nature. It's what aggregates into this sense of wetiko, this sense of aggrandizement, which is a protection mechanism. And we know that the egoic mind can resist. We know that sometimes it goes into these mind-dissolving, these ego-dissolving experiences, and it comes back stronger. If it has a full ego death, a spiritual ego death, and a psychedelic experience, it often then bounces back into a messianic phase or a ego-aggrandized phase because it survived. And it's like, oh my God, there was this psychedelic experience, and it was so big, it was so beyond the individual, but I was connected to this thing, this feeling, this oneness. And sometimes the mind rebounds, and it always rebounds, but sometimes it can take the psychedelic experience, the experience of oneness, and it can slot it into its old patterns. And then sometimes the psychedelic experience over time, the ego can also adapt, but it can find a middle path. So what I've been seeing with 5-MeO culture specifically, which is probably the most powerful ego-dissolving entheogen we know of, and we contain it also within our being, it's nicknamed the God molecule, is that sometimes it's not just about dissolving into the fullness of ego death and rebirth. Sometimes it's about teasing or buffing or allowing the muscle of the ego to adapt into the non-dual state, into the egolessness state, which these substances can engender, and to stretch it, to learn how to have some functionality. And there's levels within the Vedic maps, again, of presencing within the levels of the non-dual state. That oceanic sense of oneness that lies within is a geography, and as you go into that geography within, there's still mind, but the mind is learning to let go. And it's a process of the more you let go and open, the more you are filled by that non-dual unity space that can be revealed. So there is a process of relationship with that. So here's the thing. If the non-dual state lies within us, but the non-dual state is a sense of oneness and unity and presence and our original state of being, and we know that these cycles of consciousness come and go, as indigenous cultures tell us, there is a potential to reclaim this state, and perhaps all of history has been a blip or a phase state that is now in transition to come back into a Gaian relationship. And if the ego-dissolving psychedelic experience has been flickering on and off through history, keeping alive that state, that memory of the destination, the way forward, it's almost as if we're now coming full circle, and this potential that lies within us can be reawakened through the medicine experience of the planetary entheogens, which are there to remember and remind and renew and refresh the relationship, and to take us to a place from ego to we go, that we're no longer alone, we're no longer separate, we're no longer struggling to survive, that we're part of something very old and very new, and we're safe and we're loved and we belong and we're home. And that's what I believe is where we're headed. And to get there, we're in these times when we are experiencing a planetary ego death, and it's a medicine experience. And I like to joke, in ayahuasca, you might have many cups of medicine over a night. I feel that we're one cup in, and this is a collective experience. It's a collective grieving. It's a collective mourning what we're going through as a species on this planet at the moment. And it's also a collective journey home. Thank you. I am Rak Razam.
Thank you, Rak. That was awesome. That was amazing. And I'm sure we already have a lot of questions. If you guys still have some questions for Rak, please put them into the system and we'll get them asked. But we've got some really good questions here. So now's the time to get those out there. So let's start with this first one here. Like the Eastern sages that came in the 1920s and 30s out here to the West, and they taught their philosophy. Currently, we see ancient plants are the ones who are aiding us to heal here in the West. And what are your thoughts on that phenomenon, seeing the emergence of these plants healing us?
So when I first went down to the Amazon, the curanderos, who are the medicine people in Peru, they are often teachers, but they said to me that the teachers, the doctores, are the spirits in the plants. And we have been so compartmentalized from that relationship with nature, we no longer believe there is an intelligence in nature. And there is. I mean, the more you experience these substances and the more you go into nature, and you don't even have to take a psychedelic substance, you just have to be in nature and be open to it. There's an intelligence, but there's an active intelligence. There's a planetary intelligence. And so that active planetary intelligence is in all living things, and it's working through all living things, and it's sculpting us for its own purposes of blossoming and becoming. So just like the Eastern sages that come bearing wisdom into a culture, in nature, I mean, culture is embedded within nature, right? It's a protective mechanism, culture, that is separate from, culture is separate from nature, and it's a protective mechanism. But the sages of the planet, the sages of the mother, are the plant medicines and the spirits in the plant medicines. And when I first went down to the Amazon, they told me it's all about relationship. When we say in the West that there's a medicine or we're sick, they're like, yeah, you're sick, but it's not just that you have a physical sickness, you have a mind sickness, you have a disconnection, all Westerners. And that's why these are medicines. And the spirits in the plants are the teachers, and they sing their songs. They're icaros, they're vibratory medicines. They sing their medicines into us in ayahuasca ceremonies, or they connect to us in the web of life. And they're always radiating their consciousness. But we have become too dull or too hardened, too armored to hear them, because you don't just hear it, you feel it. And humanity has hardened its mind, its ego, and its heart. And the great warming and the great defrosting and the great melting of the heart is what happens with these medicines, that the heart opens again. And that's when we hear the great wisdom that's always been there. And it comes from the relationship with the ancestors, with the spirits of the earth, and with the earth itself. And that's the pool of wisdom that we draw upon. Nothing's ever invented or new. It's all just remembered from that great being, which is nurturing and loving us.
Yeah, and along with that, the plants have been presented, and we're seeing some awakenings, but we also see our society these days seems to be extremely reductionist and immaterialistic. But we also see many individuals like you and the people here that really are waking up. So what are your thoughts on this awakening, and how bad, does it have to get for us to get to that collective WEGO so we don't end up destroying ourselves?
Well, here's the real thing. It's like awakening's a verb, and, it's become a bit of a like most spiritual things, it's become a bit of a brand and a bit of a compartmentalized lifestyle choice as we dabble in this awakening process, or some of us are more committed on the path. But I believe it is it's a process, but we're still looking at it from the egoic point of view that I am awakening or that person is awakening. I think the planet is awakening, and those cycles of consciousness that the psychedelic ancient ancestor cultures, appreciated. They understood the cycles of time, and essentially, if you go back to the Mayans, which is a very rich and resonant culture, they believed that the center of our galaxy was what they called Hunab Ku, the womb of the Great Mother. And in 2002, at the center of our galaxy, NASA discovered a black hole, and current astrophysics points to the process that the black hole has in helping generate and birth stars into being. And they also believe, the Mayans, that the womb of the Great Mother, Hunab Ku, was the center of consciousness. And in the world ages, in the elliptic of the galaxy and our solar system traveling, we're always bombarded by these deep energies, but it shifts. It's like basically, there's an orbit and orbits within orbits, and at different stages, we still think, even if we think terrestrially, it's like here we are awakening, and then here's the planet awakening, and then the web of life continues in this infinite blossoming, into the galaxy and the universe. And if you've ever seen like the structures of the galaxy look like neuronal pathways of the brain, there's very similarities as above, so below in nature, because nature extends beyond the planetary biosphere. So I say all this to try to give a big picture map of this understanding that this process of awakening, I believe, is a process that is beyond us. And we think we're on our individual awakening path. And that individuality is embedded within Gaia, within the planet. And she's awakening, she's transforming, and she's also transforming because she's also embedded in a larger ecosystem of the solar system and the galaxy. And all of that ecosystem is always being bombarded by energy, by deep galactic cosmic rays, by magnetars, by all these star systems and energy. And all the magnetic fields of the sun and galactic sun and the earth are all connected into this macroorganism, which is awakening. It gets pretty trippy, right? But essentially, it's an organism, and there's layers and levels of it, and there's a process underway of deep galactic energies and solar energies, and the relationship between the sun and the earth. And the earth is like, I like to say, the earth is like it's almost like an earthgasm, right? Like there's a process of awakening in the earth that is one of her species. We're being radiated this energy, which is being broadcast. And that is what is awakening us. And then we start to get this individual receiving of the signal, which is like, oh, I am awakening. I'm doing it. I'm on my journey of awakening. And yes, you are. We all are. And it's happening very, very fast now. So, I mean, it's a whole nother story, but it's all related of like this week it hit the headlines. And every week it's like, what now? What fresh heaven is this? But the Arctic Circle melted again. I mean, it's been doing this lately, but it was experiencing 100 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. And we've seen a cascade of flooding and rainfall and locust plagues and all these compounding factors. But essentially, the Earth is in rapid transformation. And yes, humans have contributed to that with global warming, but global warming has happened many times before in the previous species extinctions. There's a process in the living organism of the planet which is part of its awakening and part of our awakening. And it creates a sense of urgency. And this is really good in a sense, because everything we thought about ourselves and about the world has been a very brief moment in time. It's been those 13,000 years of the interglacial period where it's been warm enough for humans like an algae bloom to cover the planet. And we've just gone rampant. We've just run rampant over the planet. And now that time is ending. And the thing is, we can't avoid it. If you've ever had a challenging psychedelic experience, sometimes the mind tries to avoid it. It's too much for the mind to let the mind go, to really know who and what we are. We scream and we run from it and we do anything to like not go there. And yet we're being invited to go there. We're being asked to go there. And in fact, there's no not going there, because this is a planetary awakening. It's a planetary ceremony. And it's an initiation, and it's happened before. Humans have survived 5 previous species extinctions, and hopefully some of us will survive this one. But we're not going to survive in the old normal. And we're not even going to survive in the new normal that they're trying to build for us within culture, because nature is awakening, nature is transforming, and she is the great equalizer. She has a plan. It's basically a rebirth, but to rebirth, you need to have a death. And this is what the ego mind has been fearing for its individual life and for its species life. We fear death because we don't remember what's behind death. We don't remember that non-dual state of oneness and being that births us, that we come from and that we go back to. And that's what my 5-MeO experiences have helped me remember and realize, and other experiences can too. It's not about the particular entheogen or medicine. It's about the fact of how much we can surrender, how much we can let go, how much we can open up, how much we can drink in that unity conscious ocean that is our being. And if you can, there's not just that feeling of oneness and inevitability to this state, that sense of going home. It feels to me that space, that state, that grace of oneness is where we come from. And that it's only the ego which fears, the mind fears, the heart feels. And when we drop the fear in the ego and we come into the heart brain or the heart mind and the gut instinct again, we receive the signal of oneness and we're home. And we can be home in that space, awakened as human beings on earth. We don't have to physically die and go back to the Godhead, though we will one day. We come from there, we go back to there, but we can hold space to learn how to lower the egoic mind and to open the heart and to let God have the human experience through us. I mean, that's what they say. We're human beings having a divine experience. But even that's the tricky ego, thinking of the way around, like it's like God is actually having the human experience of the construct of the ego identity, but we keep thinking we're having it and that we still keep getting it the other way around. So I think the process has been initiated, which is natural, which is going to be planetary, disaster movie. But I mean, the language is important because it's not a disaster, it's a letting go. It's the 5 stages of grief. We've been in denial, right? The rage is coming, the bargaining is coming, the grief is coming, and eventually there will be acceptance. But in that process, there is going to be a planetary mobilization and a planetary cultural change of awakening where we have to come together because there are no others. There's us and all the species, but this is our planet. This is our home. This is our space. We have to come together in love because that is the antidote to fear. And that is the antidote, the WEGO to the ego. And these medicines, when they've been helping alleviate our species PTSD, when we come to that sense of security, when our base chakra feels safe, when we can go up the chakras into the heart, when we can blossom and open, then we get the keys to the kingdom. Then we understand what's going on. It's this mind which struggles and survives and protects, and we're all still going through it, and it's just begun. So yeah, the process of awakening, I believe, is a process that is beyond us and is being received in our consciousness now. And I believe that it's going to be messy because birth is messy and beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned Gaia. She's going through some things. Do you see Gaia's own journey as possibly a hero's journey? Do you see at all some of the things going on? You mentioned global warming. We've got this pandemic. Is that potentially her immune system at work during her journey?
It's a loaded question these days to get into the pandemic type of stories. So, right at the start, I said I'm a storyteller, right? And I've been working on some screenplays recently, and it's about all of this, right? It's putting medicine memes into Hollywood. That's my focus at the moment. And so, what you've got to remember is that all of this is a story. right? We're living through the story, and the civilizational story is breaking down to make way for a new story. So I've been looking at Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, for my screenwriting, and that's a really beautiful way to phrase that. Thank you. Of like, Gaia is on her own hero's journey or heroine's journey, right? And that there are stages to that journey. And, essentially, if we break it down to just the 3-act structure, the hero's journey is of leaving the unknown behind, right? And that's the first step. It's that you have to let go of all that's gone before, because we're going into new territory, and Gaia's going into new territory in this iteration. She goes through these extinction events every 100,000 or so years with the ice ages that form, and then she makes new life forms. And it's that process of the spearhead of evolution forcing us to change. Like, DNA responds to its environment. If you're just in a Japanese Zaibitsu work cubicle and you live for 50 years and get a gold pocket watch when you retire, and you're not getting any nature, your DNA is just denuded and it's just dead and it's not responding. But if you're on the cusp of a planetary emergency and you're out there, you're getting information from the trees and the plants and the light and the soil, and all of nature is talking to the rest of nature, including us. And it's all saying, it's time, it's happening. It's this planetary, as you say, hero's journey. And the first step is that removal of the known. You have to leave the known world behind, and you strike out into the unknown. And that's where the second stage begins of the initiation. And this is where we're at. The old world is being let go, and we're scrabbling to hold on to it. And all the cultural systems are doing their best. But really, I think it's the end has begun. And it's going to be, it needs to. We have this initiation somewhere in our near future that's coming. We're going through it now. And the initiation potentially is the psychedelic experience. I mean, in the Campbell myth metaphor, the initiation is a sense of psychic connection or psychic instigation. It's a new stage of consciousness beyond what we were inhabiting in the old stage of consciousness. And this is the thing. We have a capacity within ourselves to continue to evolve, but it won't evolve if we're just the same, right? If you just sit in there in the office cubicle, nothing is needed. I mean, your body is responding to nature. So when nature starts to go on a heroine's journey and leave behind the known and transform and have an initiation, we're having an initiation too. Now, the third stage of the hero's journey is the interesting one if you look at this cultural transformation, because it's coming back to the tribe. It's coming back to the old world that you'd left behind, new, and bringing your knowledge with you. And this is where you could look upon our individual awakenings and this message which is coming through. I mean, the core of the psychedelic experience is that we're connected to something larger, and yet we're having it like, one person at a time. Imagine if we have like 7.5 billion people having a psychedelic initiation through the planetary transformation all at the same time. That's going to be pretty big to integrate and to come back to the new normal. But that's the potential of what we're doing, is that however we survive, however we let go of the ego and the fear and open up to the process that's underway and trust the process that's underway, we're still so anchored to the body and to the flesh and to the survival because we fear death, because we don't understand what's beyond death, because we don't understand what life is. But if we can let go of all that fear, have the initiation, then there's a planetary new normal, which is that integration of the hero's journey. And it's enormous. I mean, these are really nice words, and this is a great conversation. But the living of this in this generation, like this apocalyptic moment we're going through, and remembering that the translation in Greek for apocalypse simply means the revealing. It doesn't necessarily mean, the end times, or it's the end of the old times, but there's a continuation of something, of us, in some form coming in the future. But it is a planetary initiation we're going through, and a planetary awakening.
Very good. So you mentioned a group mind. You talked about collective consciousness and collective PTSD. What do you mean by group mind? What might that look like practically, and how could it be related to AI and maybe some ways to even connect brains together?
Okay, well, those things are related, but I'd take a differentiation of them in the sense that look at nature. Nothing is new under the sun, right? And we have ways of individuating. We have, I mean, humans are, I guess, some of the most damaged and individuated creatures because most of the other species live in some type of tribal or herd or collectivism group identity, It even culminates, I say, in the insects. And all of those creatures have evolved. They've potentially had a stage when they've been individuated and separated as well. But the insects have learned how to behave as a group organism, as a collective. And we have this potential as well. I actually have a little quote here from Bruce Lipton, who is a biologist and a scientist. And here's his quote. Listen to this. He says, "While we are dismayed by the current life-threatening crises that are challenging civilization, we may be encouraged by observing evolution's repetitive pattern. It is becoming apparent that civilization is being pushed into entering the next phase of evolution, a stage in which human beings are the equivalent of cells assembling into a new unity, expressed as humanity. By definition, humanity is a multicellular superorganism comprised of 7 billion human cells." So that idea of collectivism is basically what different insects have gone through on their frequency of consciousness. So what I'm saying is there's a capacity in consciousness itself to share a collective, telepathic, species-mediated union and still be individuated creatures separate from nature but more connected. We can see this in nature. And so it's possible. And yet the pressures we're going through on the planet at the moment, the reason we've survived the 5 species extinctions we have previously is because we had each other. Like no one human being can survive on their own. You need a family, you need a tribe, you need the others. And those others act as an extension of the human organism for survival. And so you look at the way insects collectivize now and the pressure we're on in a planetary transformation, it seems to be that if we're going to get through this, we're going to get through this together, not as individuals or individual nation states, but as one humanity. That pressure is like the pressure of coal being transformed into diamond over 6 million years. The intense pressure changes its atomic structure. The intense pressure in our environment, which is a process of the planet awakening, is activating our DNA. It's activating our full capacity for consciousness. And one model for where that could go is a type of hive mind, collective group, telepathic belonging. And it's very possible because we can see it in nature already. We know it's there. We know there's a species advantage to that to help you survive. And there also seems to be some type of, I don't know, it's like in a lot of science fiction, that type of group Borganism, hive mind is seen as alien and is seen as something to reject from this individuated consciousness. But if you remember, again, the whole context of this talk, that individuated consciousness is the trauma speaking, then if we don't protect, the Borg in Star Trek, they say you will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. Yeah. Go with it, right? So if we look at technology, about 50,000 or more years ago, we started to stop evolving genetically and we started to start evolving exosomatically outside the body with our technology. So everything that technology is doing on the outside with this amazing internet and, our phones and AIs and Elon Musk wanting to make brain machine interfaces that put brains together, it's like a Petri dish. It's like the ego in a little kid in a toy lab experimenting, and that's how we're learning. But everything that they're doing with the external technology is just an extension of our consciousness. Our consciousness has created that technology, outside of ourselves, thinking it's separate, but it's part of us, right? And so that whole idea about AIs, it's like it's our children in a sense, you know. It's like we built this whole internet, like a mind across the planet, which is like a skin of the planet. Like the planet has, Gaia has not just the physical and the atmosphere and the ionosphere and the lithosphere and the magnetic field and the heliosphere at the edge of the solar system. There's all these really subtle frequencies of conscious being in the planet, and now the internet is the latest one. And so we've been building something through the apex of civilization in the very short amount of time we had, with the consciousness we had. And it strikes me as no mistake that something is building itself through us. And again, we think we're doing it. But the experiments with potential brain interface and the chips and all of that, there's a lot of fear in the community again around that. I think that it is a species stepping up, but there's also a danger in externalizing the technology to do the thing for us that we can already do ourselves. Like the psychedelic experience reveals that we are psychedelic, right? We are biological beings which are having a consciousness experience, and that we can come together into a hive mind. We can come together and share consciousness in a group telepathic situation. There's many tribes. There's tribes in the Amazon which drink ayahuasca together as a tribe and go into a group medicine hallucinogenic space and use it to divine or use it to connect. And that there's a danger of separation of technology, specifically sort of hard machine, metallic technology, from the organic, natural, originating matrix that we're embedded in. There's a bifurcation of the species happening. And it's like Gaia has produced the internet and produced the machines and is producing the Borg, but I still see there's some type of duality and some type of danger inherent in it's almost as if there's a vector and a pathway which is developing to go deeper into the virtual at the expense of forgetting the natural. And it's hard because the virtual is part of the natural, and yet unless the virtual has heart, unless you can feel in the virtual, then it's not a path of the heart. It's a path of the mind. And remembering the mind is essentially a traumatized ego. If we're building a more invisibilized box for our ego to hide away from nature, to hide away from planetary ecological transformation, devastation, rebirthing, then that's not a path of the heart. That's a path of hiding and protecting. And there's great advances that might be coming with neurotechnology, but they have to also understand what the mind really is. And it's not just this. And if they're extending this, but not the heart, then they haven't got the whole shebang, and they're creating a Frankenstein machine that doesn't have heart. You got to trust. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. We've only got a minute and a half, so I don't know if we can squeeze this in, but I also wanted to use this question as a segue to hear what else is coming from you and what we should be looking out for. But you did a field study of the Sonoran Desert toad back in 2017. And so I don't know if you plan to do another one, if you have any thoughts on the conservation of this animal who happens to live right here in my backyard in Arizona. And then use that to talk about what else you have coming up. We got 1 minute left.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I know.
So essentially, like all the species are sacred. All the species are psychedelic in their own way. What can I say in a minute? Listen, it's going to get darkest before it gets light. And there's going to be great transformations that we're living through, not just culturally, but ecologically. The real key to this time is to go within, not just to the mind, to break open the head and to break open the heart. Live a path of truth and love, because love is the antidote to fear. And there's so much fear in the world at the moment. And it's all from a place of the mind, fearing, and the ego. And yes, shit is hitting the fan, right? But it's needed. If you remember that it's this planetary hero's journey that we're all on, that this is the journey of a lifetime. And it's going to require that, right? It's going to require you to be brave and to sacrifice. And the original Latin for sacrifice is to make sacred. So journey a path of the heart and trust, and reach out to each other and use the medicines to find that space within where you can remember the feeling of connection, because we're going to need that feeling of connection and oneness to get through this phase that's coming.
Wonderful, beautiful, love it, Rak. Thank you so much for your contribution and your wisdom here. Great information. Thank everybody else for coming and attending this event. And don't forget, 45 minutes from now is the next session, and it is psychedelics, shamanism, non-duality, and dying. So click the same link, come on back, and keep enjoying the non-duality summit. Thanks, everybody.